it sounds like what you're saying is that when we get down to things that could, be wrong Mariology, it's really, when you look at the details, it's really not seemingly ever that it's simply a case of being too devoted to Mary, or ascribing too much grace to Mary. It's that it's a category mistake of some kind, that she's being put in some she's being redefined in some way that she isn't.
Exactly. The third meaning of it, and that's the meaning that we tend to make, is that, as Saint Anselm said, that her purity is such that no one other than God can understand it. He sort of riffs on his ontological argument, saying that basically within the limits of finitude and what human nature is, basically the sky's the limit. She's subordinated to Christ. She's totally dependent on Christ's grace. But he says that where Christ's grace maxes out, we don't, that's way up there. And so that's sort of what this other term of Marian maximalism is that basically if you keep faithful to who she is, basically you're never going to praise her and love her more than God himself has. It's having her raise his only son, that's a pretty significant endorsement there.
Right. So that leads to things that comments by, say, Blessed John Duns Scotus or St. Alphonsus Liguori, saying to the effect that if something good could be said about Mary, in terms of her level of grace, her level of virtue, her privileges from God, and it's not contrary to settled doctrine, and it's not, and there's at least some basis for believing that it could be true, we ought to believe that it is true.
Yeah,
which may at first seem like a strong and strange claim, but as you point out, we are told she is full of grace, and as St. Anselm said, how are we going to put a limit on that, or know where that stops with our finite intellects and our lack of experience of what she's experiencing united with God?
Well, this is one of the basic points of Saint or Blessed John Duns Scotus with the Immaculate Conception, because the big question was, it's the common inheritance that Mary is free of sin. That's the common understanding of apostolic Christianity. But then how do you explain that she's also redeemed by Christ? And Blessed John Duns Scotus is just saying, well, she's free from sin because she's perfectly redeemed. She's the absolute limits of what redemption means. And then St. Maximilian also brings in saying that she is the paradigm of salvation. We're sort of the misshapen weirdos. It's not that she's the exception, we are. She is the rule of what it means to be saved because she's perfectly saved. And it's the question of, okay, so Christ's grace is, this will sound like, you could say Christ's grace is practically infinite. His merits are infinite, quasi-infinite. So then that's communicated to Our Lady, who's also full of grace. Right. And then so the question is are there limits that Christ would put on the amount of grace that he communicates, just to do it? That'd be a little bit too much. So I'm not going to give you everything I can, just kind of, but no, he pours out on her all that he wins by his passion, by his fidelity to the Father. And this is the thing, she's full of grace, but it's full of grace not as the source, but as the receptive. And so I forget if it was in Bonaventure or some other great Franciscan theologian, and I've heard this cited several times. But, and this is, this was an analogy that's kind of like, oh, wow, that, so Christ is a divine person with a human nature. And Scotus underlines that his human nature is an integral human nature. His divine identity doesn't directly impinge on his humanity, making it in some way different. It's a fully human. He is the most fully human of all of us. Okay, but it's a graced human nature. He receives grace in his human nature. So the example or the analogy given is that when you look at the Father and the Son are equally God. They equally possess the divinity as their own. And if you ignore the order of processions, you just look at them, it's like, that's God. The Father is God, the Son is God. And then the analogy is, well, it's a similar way with the fullness of grace, that Christ is full of grace because of, not like it's a direct effect because of his identity, but it's postulated by his divine identity. So he is the source of grace. God creates the grace, and then Christ is filled with grace. And then he communicates that to Our Lady. And this is something I think contemporary Christology has underlined too, that the grace, Christ works by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so he has that fullness of grace, that fullness of the Holy Spirit that he's received. And then he communicates that to Our Lady. And this is something that the Franciscans doctors would say, that just as the Father and the Son, if you don't pay attention to who gives the Father bestowing the divinity on the Son, they look almost equal. Well, they are equal. And so he says, likewise, Christ fully communicates the graces that he wins to Our Lady, such that if you prescind from source and reception, it's like Jesus and Mary, they're kind of, there's a certain parity with a T, in how graced they are, which is mind-blowing. But then one gives them to the other. So what we're doing there is we're not trying to make Mary equal with Jesus. We're just saying that Jesus can open the floodgates and pour everything that he wins out on Our Lady. That the grace of union, of course, that's something he can't give, because that's who he is. And being a human person is absolutely central to who Our Lady is. It's not that if we turn her into God, it gets better. No, it doesn't. Being a fully graced human person is what's so incredible about her.
Right.
And yeah, so that's sort of an orthodox understanding of Marian maximalism is
right.
And like you said, with the doctrinal implications, this is something that the theologian I tend to follow, Father Peter Damian Fellner, who passed away about 6 years ago, he would point out, basically, he says, if you start ragging on Our Lady and trying to diminish her, what you're doing is you're diminishing the question of what grace can do, and you're diminishing basically, he says, the fundamental, you could say, Protestant problem is that you're rendering creation completely passive. But anyway, so his point is if you try to remove Mary from having this place of having received that fullness of grace, she's then able to act in such a way in the world, working with Christ and achieving and distributing the fruits of salvation, that if you deny that of her, then basically what you're denying is that grace can render creation supernaturally active. And then if that's the case, then what you're doing is you're reducing it basically says you end up in a form of pantheism, because then if Mary can't be active in the acquisition of graces at the cross with her son, having received the grace to be able to even do that from her son, well, then Christ's humanity, how can Christ's humanity save us? Because again, that's a human nature, that he's being obedient to the Father with a human will.
Yeah.
And so, well, then you end up in this sort of Hegelian pantheist where it's just that it's Christ's human nature is completely passive. And it's just the fact that God the Son is being crucified. And whether it's just a sort of idea that the human nature just becomes a punching bag that the Father is able to vent his frustration on, or whether it becomes a sort of strange Hegelian, like, God bringing finitude into the very divinity, then yeah, you get very quickly in pantheism.